Hello class. The Pokemon you decide to lead with can make or break a game, so it's essential that you understand how to choose well. In this lecture, I'll explain what makes a good lead Pokemon, go over the steps to picking the best lead, and finally, we'll walk through a few examples. Those examples will be in the Scarlet and Violet Overused tier, the main format for competitive singles, but the principles of this video apply to almost all singles formats. And if you're worried by the length of the video that I'm going to bombard you with too much information and overcomplicate things to pad the runtime, don't worry. Over half of this video is walking through examples, so if you just want the guide, that's about the first 11 minutes. Getting right into it, what makes a good lead Pokemon? It's important to know which Pokemon are generally solid leads, not only to help guide you to which of your own Pokemon you should be leading with often, but also to help you predict what your opponent will lead with. There are three main traits that make a Pokemon a generally good lead. The first is having some move that is helpful long term, past that first turn. The most common example here is entry hazards. If your lead can set Stealth Rock, that entry hazard is going to be great until it's removed, and the sooner you get the hazard up, the better. Landorus is a great example of one of these leads. It's a very strong stealth rocker. But entry hazards are not the only moves that are beneficial long term. Knockoff is another example. If you can remove your opponent's item, once again, the sooner the better, that's the entire game your opponent's Pokemon will go itemless. Status moves are another example. If you can burn, poison, or paralyze something, that's going to be helpful for the rest of the game. Light Screen and Reflect won't help the entire game, but it will help for 8 turns, so that's another case of a move helping long term that can make a Pokemon a strong lead. You can also throw abilities that have a long-term effect into this category. Weather and terrain setting abilities obviously help the rest of the team, and those Pokemon often make great leads. The second trait that indicates a Pokemon is a good lead is that it has a pivoting move. Pivoting moves are great because they allow you to reposition yourself. If you have a good lead matchup, great, stay in. If you got a bad lead matchup, you can deal damage while switching out. Choice Specs Dragapult is a great example of this kind of lead. If your opponent leads with something you match up well against, like a Garchomp, awesome, great, you can threaten a Draco Meteor. If it's something you can't do well against, like a Ting-Lu, no problem, you can U-turn out and pivot into something on your team that does do well against Ting-Lu. Slow pivots are also solid leads. They operate on a similar principle, except they're designed to eat a hit and then pivot out into a more favorable matchup. This is sometimes even better, as it often allows you to bring in a really powerful breaker early game. Galarian Slowking is a great example of an effective slow pivot lead. The last trait that indicates a Pokemon is a good lead is that it's a very strong breaker. A lot of the time you want to start the game by applying immediate pressure and wearing down your opponent's team right away. Choice Specs Kyurem is a great example of this. It's a very powerful Pokemon, and it matches up well into a lot of common leads. And a lot of good leads have many of these traits. Landorus can set Stealth Rock, and it pivots. Hoopa Unbound is a really powerful breaker, and it can use Knockoff to remove something's item. An Ogerpon Wellspring running Spikes can have all three of these traits. It can set hazards, pivot with U-turn, and it's a really strong breaker that can threaten your opponent's defensive core right away. However, if a Pokemon has none of these traits, it's almost certainly a bad lead. To give some examples, Dragonite is usually a pretty bad lead. Generally, it's not running any moves that will help long term, it can't pivot, and it's not a super scary breaker. Particularly Dragon Dance sets are terrible leads. You almost never want to lead with a setup sweeper because they're much more likely to work later in the game when your opponent's team is worn down. For another bad lead example, Gholdengo. It's a great Pokemon, but rarely is it a good lead. Once again, it doesn't usually run any moves that are helpful long term, it has no pivoting moves, and it's not a crazy breaker. Also note that the set of your Pokemon absolutely does change how good the Pokemon is as a lead. It's not just set in stone that certain Pokemon are good leads and others aren't. Standard Swords Dance Kingambit is a terrible lead, but if you're running some wacky Stealth Rock Thunderwave Kingambit, that is a good lead. Alright, now that you generally understand what good and bad lead Pokemon are, let's break down the process of selecting a lead. So first off, I want to clarify that there are 3 questions you should ask yourself at the start of every game at Team Preview. 1. What do I have that's good against my opponent? 2. What does my opponent have that's good against me? And 3. What should I lead with? Mostly, people skip right to question 3, they don't analyze the matchup, and this is a big mistake. Understanding what the stronger and weaker Pokemon are on both sides is really helpful for many reasons. It can help you avoid accidentally sacking a Pokemon that you needed to preserve for a certain threat. It can help guide you to what Pokemon you should allow to die if you're in a rough spot. It tells you what you should be trying to bring onto the field, and how to approach the game as a whole. But most importantly for this video, understanding what is strong against you and what is strong against your opponent is great for identifying your opponent's likely leads. If you find that you struggle to determine whether you have a good matchup or not, or you have a tough time identifying threats on both sides of the field, I'll link videos in the description that focus on both of these topics, but for the sake of not bloating this video, I'm going to just focus on that question 3. What should you lead with? And step 1 of picking a good lead is identifying your opponent's likely leads. The best lead is one that counters whatever your opponent leads with, so you absolutely need to know what your opponent's likely options are. How do you determine this? Well, first of all, your opponent will likely start with a generally good lead Pokemon. They probably won't lead with their Kingambit or Dragonite or Zamazenta. They're much more likely to lead with something like their Landorus or Dragapult. This is why it's so important to understand which Pokemon are good leads and which aren't. It's the easiest way to eliminate unlikely possibilities. Secondly, your opponent is likely to lead with something that's good against your team. Landorus is a great lead, but if you have 3 ice types on your team, your opponent probably won't start with their Landorus. Conversely, if your opponent has a breaker that one-hit KOs 5 out of 6 Pokemon on your team, there's a good shot they're going to start with that. Or it could be something that's good against you defensively. Maybe your opponent has a wall that's only threatened by 1 or 2 members on your team. That would also make it a probable lead for them. Your opponent will also probably lead with something that counters your obvious leads. Glimmora is a fantastic hazard-setting lead and one of the most common leads in Scarlet and Violet overused by far. Its ability Toxic Debris setting Toxic Spikes when it's hit makes it absolutely made to lead. So if you have something like this on your team, that's a very obvious, very common lead, your opponent probably won't just lead with something that loses to it. And there's also a chance your opponent will just lead with the most obvious lead on their team, whatever they typically lead with. Particularly in lower levels of play, many players autopilot to the typical strong lead. So if you're facing someone who you don't think is a very strong player and they're using a Glimmora hyper offense, they will probably lead with that Glimmora almost 100% of the time. Even if you have a perfect counter lead, something like an Iron Crown that can one-hit KO a Focus Sash Glimmora with Tachyon Cutter, your opponent might just go full brain dead and lead with it anyway. I've seen it happen countless times. Now this is a lot of information and I'm not suggesting you think through all these possibilities every time you're at Team Preview. When you think about leads at Team Preview, keep your thoughts simple. First, eliminate Pokemon that aren't generally good leads, and then try to identify which Pokemon are good against your team. Almost every time, that will give you a good idea of what your opponent will start with. And the other subtleties around leading will come naturally with practice. The more you practice, eventually you'll get to the point where you know your opponent's likely leads almost automatically. It takes me just a few seconds to know what my opponent's likely leads are. Also note that in this step, you may end up with a lot of likely leads from your opponent. I've had games where all 6 Pokemon seemed somewhat probable from my opponent. I've also had games where I'm almost 100% sure my opponent will lead with one specific Pokemon. Generally though, you'll have identified 2 to 4 likely leads at this step. Alright, moving on to step 2, identifying your own possible leads. This step is pretty simple. Consider your opponent's likely leads and ask yourself what you have that matches up well against most or all of them. Some Pokemon on your team are easy to eliminate as they're just generally not good leads, and others are easy to eliminate because they're terrible against most of your opponent's likely leads. Sometimes you'll see that something on your team is just obviously amazing. Maybe it even leads well against all 6 Pokemon on your opponent's team. In that case, great news, just go with that. You can skip this entire process if you see a lead that dominant, but it's rare. Generally, you'll be able to identify around 2 to 3 leads on your team that seem like they could be decent. Then you move on to step 3, assessing the risk and reward of these leads. Look at the Pokemon you selected as possible leads and consider what might happen if you lead with each of them. A good question to ask here is, what if you get the lead wrong? Think a couple turns ahead and see what happens. Say you think your Choice Specs Dragapult is a good lead, matches up well into 3 out of the 4 likely leads you identified for your opponent. But the 4th lead, the one your Dragapult isn't good against, is your opponent's Primarina. So ask yourself, what if I get it wrong? What if I lead Choice Specs Dragapult into Primarina? Well, if you have an Assault Vest Galarian Slowking in the back, this is totally fine. You just U-turn into your Galarian Slowking. But what if your team has no good Primarina switch in? Then there's a much higher cost to getting this Dragapult play wrong. It may be a better option to go with the Pokemon that covers only 2 out of your opponent's 4 likely leads, if it avoids a potential disaster. But you also might notice you have a terrible matchup. Maybe you know your team absolutely hates sand teams. You've lost to sand the last 5 times you faced one, and now you see another sand team in front of you. Well, I'd say you probably have a bad team and need to rework it, but for the sake of that particular battle, if you're in a truly dire matchup, maybe you can't afford to go with the safer lead option. You might need to make a prediction of the exact singular Pokemon your opponent will lead with, and pick your lead to punish that the most. There is unfortunately no quick guide to becoming better at weighing risk versus reward. It's just something that you'll get better at with practice. Alright, now that was pretty complicated, so let's put that into practice. I'll go over 4 examples. First, let me introduce you to the team I'm using so we're operating with the same information as I go through these examples. This is a classic and very old team, built around Choice Specs Kyurem with Blizzard. It's got Blizzard because it's supported by a specially defensive chili reception Galarian Slowking. The team's defensive wall is a pretty standard speedy Rocky Helmet Landorus. Iron Valiant is a booster energy mixed set. For hazard control, we have a standard Libero Cinderace with Will-O-Wisp. And lastly, we've got Kingambit, standard leftovers bulky Swords Dance set with Terra Ghost for Dragonite. If you want the importable, this team and all teams shown in this video are in the description. Feel free to check that out if you want to study the exact sets in further detail, but the general sets of the team should be enough to follow the examples we go over. This team functions as a pretty standard offense, trying to bring in Kyurem as much as possible to break and clean up with sweepers like Iron Valiant and or Kingambit. The only thing about this team that's somewhat unique is that Cinderace is the only form of hazard control, so you actually often don't want to set Stealth Rock early game with Landorus, as you'd rather court change your opponent's hazards later. Alright, now let's get into the example. I'd encourage you to pause and try to go through the 3 steps yourself. Identify your opponent's likely leads, your possible leads, and then weigh the risk-reward and make a call. Then you can unpause and see how close you were. So I see we're facing Mamoswine, Gholdengo, Glimmora, Ogerpon, Wellspring, Iron Valiant, and Kingambit. Right away we can eliminate some Pokemon. I don't see a Kingambit or Gholdengo lead as very likely. Also, you see I'll be putting grayish boxes around eliminated Pokemon as we go to help visualize this. Kingambit is a sweeper, terrible lead, nobody really ever leads with it. Gholdengo on some rare occasions can be a lead if it's amazing against your team, but my team is pretty solid against Gholdengo. We can pretty safely eliminate Iron Valiant as well. Some Iron Valiant sets are good leads if it's, say, a Choice Specs breaker, but given this looks like Hyper Offense, I'm 95% sure that's a booster energy set. And those make terrible leads because you're burning booster energy and you're trying to sweep when the opponent's team is fully healthy. So we're left with likely leads of Mamoswine, Ogerpon, Wellspring, and Glimmora. And they're all possible, but I'd say Glimmora and Mamoswine are the top 2 for sure, since they can both set Stealth Rock. Hyper Offense teams have such short games that it's really important for them to get Stealth Rock up as soon as possible. Both Mamoswine and Glimmora can run Focus Sash lead sets, and that's what I'm guessing at least one of them is. Okay, so step 1 is done, let's move on to step 2. Kingambit is a terrible lead for me, so is Iron Valiant. We don't start with these 2 almost ever. Cinderace isn't very good because it's terrible against Glimmora, Slowking isn't very good because it's terrible against Mamoswine, and Landorus is also terrible against Mamoswine. If we look at Kyurem, it can one-hit KO or at least bring Mamoswine and Glimmora down to their Focus Sash with Draco Meteor and Earth Power respectively, and it outspeeds both. It doesn't die to Glimmora Power Gem, and if my opponent does decide to hit me, they sacrifice setting Stealth Rock, so Kyurem looks super strong here, and bonus, it also leads really well into Ogerpon Wellspring, the 3rd most likely lead. And if we look at what happened, it was indeed a Mamoswine lead, and hey, pleasant surprise, it wasn't Focus Sash, so I start the game with a nice one-hit KO. Step 3 wasn't really necessary here because an obvious lead revealed itself during Step 2. Now for another example, I'll go through this one a bit faster. Once again, pause and try it for yourself first. Okay, so opponent won't lead with Iron Valiant, Dragonite, or Kingambit, all are sweepers, so we eliminate those. Pecharunt is unlikely since I have a very hard counter to it with Galarian Slowking. That leaves Wellspring and Ting-Lu. Probably Ting-Lu is more likely because it has Stealth Rock. On my side, we eliminate Iron Valiant and Kingambit, as we almost always should. Landorus also isn't great here. Takes a ton from Wellspring's Ivy Cudgel, and we really want it healthy for dealing with Kingambit later, so we don't want it eating a bunch of Ruinations from Ting-Lu. We also don't want to set Stealth Rock early this game, we'd rather court change whatever Ting-Lu sets later, so Landorus is definitely out. Our remaining 3 look pretty good. Galarian Slowking can poison both leads for my opponent, Cinderace can burn them both, and Kyurem can hit both super effectively. Now we've got to move on to step 3, weighing that risk and reward. The first I'm going to take out of consideration is Kyurem. It doesn't look bad at all, but I don't want it to get worn down when it could be helpful for dealing with Dragonite or even Kingambit later. And if Ting-Lu leads, it can sponge a Kyurem's hit pretty well, set Stealth Rock, and then my opponent can switch out into Kingambit, putting me in a not so great spot. Cinderace doesn't look bad, but thinking a few turns ahead, if I do lead with Cinderace and go for Will-O-Wisp, my opponent probably goes into Pecharunt, then they can Parting Shot and they have the upper hand. And then there's also the chance I miss Will-O-Wisp. Galarian Slowking doesn't love eating an Ivy Cudgel or an Earthquake, but it can poison Ting-Lu, and if they lead Wellspring, I can Chilly Reception into Kyurem and click a huge Blizzard. And my opponent's only good response to Galarian Slowking is Kingambit, which is super easy for me to answer early game. I can just go into Landorus to scare it out and U-turn. So I settle on Galarian Slowking. This helps me wear down the Ting-Lu with very minimal chip to my own team, and sets me up for a very nice court change later. This was a tougher one. If you said Kyurem or Cinderace, I wouldn't even call you wrong. I'd say those are valid leads as well. Before we move on to the next example, I want to make one quick clarification. Twice in a row, you just saw me instantly discount Kingambit and Iron Valiant as leads, and this is usually what you should do as well. Usually is the key word though. There are some rare cases where if one of these typical bad leads has an instantly strong matchup against your opponent or can shut down some certain strategy or threatening Pokemon, it is a good idea to lead with it. I lead with Kingambit maybe 1 in 200 games, but it happens. Let's look at another example with a different team. This is a Regenerator spam balance. The star of the team is a classic Choice Band Lokix. The main breaker is a Life Orb Hydrapple. I prefer Leaf Storm over Giga Drain. We've got a speed and HP invested Rocky Helmet Great Tusk for support and setting Stealth Rock. A bulky Blaze Cinderace to further help with hazard removal. Once again, we've got Will-O-Wisp on it. Galarian Slowking again as well, this time a physically defensive Colbur Berry set, and a very specially bulky Assault Vest Tornadus as the main special wall of the team. The idea of this team is to utilize the Regenerator pivoting core of Galarian Slowking and Tornadus to bring in either Lokix or Hydrapple. Against bulkier teams, Hydrapple can break, and against more offensive teams, Lokix can spam First Impression. Alright, example time. Once again, pause here if you want to try it for yourself. We're facing a Rain team. They definitely won't lead with Raging Bolt since they don't want to burn the booster energy. They won't lead with Overquill. It needs Rain and Swords Dance to be threatening. And remember, starting with Sweepers almost never happens. Kingambit can be eliminated for the same reason. So Pelipper, Iron Treads, and Barraskewda are the likely possibilities. You might think Pelipper is extremely likely here because it's a Rain team, but I actually somewhat doubt it. People are very hesitant to lead Pelipper against Galarian Slowking teams since the Galarian Slowking can just slow pivot with Chilly Reception, end Rain, and go into a counter. Still, it is a Rain team, and Pelipper is such a common lead for Rain that I'd be a fool to discount the possibility. Alright, step 2, what are my possible leads? Well, let's get rid of Great Tusk. That's bad against Pelipper and Barraskewda. Cinderace is bad against those two as well. Lokix isn't great here either. It dies to Pelipper Hurricane, and it lets Iron Tread set up Stealth Rock fairly easily, or worse, knock off our Choice Band, which we really don't want to lose because Banded First Impression looks amazing here. And Barraskewda puts Lokix in an awkward spot where we risk dying if we don't use First Impression, but if we do use First Impression as Pelipper enters, Pelipper gets a great U-turn that we can't do much about. Tornadus is decent against all three. It can slow pivot on Barraskewda, heat wave the treads, and knock off on Pelipper, so we'll include that. Galarian Slowking isn't as good against treads, but it's amazing against Pelipper since we could instantly end Rain, and it's quite good against Barraskewda as well. Hydrapple is also pretty solid. One-hit KOs Iron Treads with Earth Power, and it lives Max Attack Ice Spinner plus Life Orb Recoil. Also lives a Pelipper Hurricane plus Life Orb Recoil, and it one-hit KOs Pelipper with Leaf Storm. If the Pelipper is offensive though, or has Ice Beam, it will kill. And Hydrapple is great into Barraskewda. We basically get to fire off a free hit. I'd say the two that look best are Tornadus and Hydrapple. Those are good against all of the probable leads. But now let's move on to step 3, risk versus reward. Looking at Tornadus first, if the Treads is bulky, Heat Wave won't do very much, and Treads will get up rocks. It's going to be tough to court change or rapid spin against Rain, so that could be bad. Also, if I lead Tornadus against Pelipper, there's no guarantee they'll stay in and eat the knockoff. They could switch hard into Raging Bolt, which would be pretty difficult. Hydrapple, they have no switch-in on their entire team. The only real risk is that if Pelipper is offensive, Hurricane will kill, or it might randomly have Ice Beam. Overall, I'd say Hydrapple seems like a better call here. There are very few ways it goes poorly, whereas Tornadus could go poorly in many ways. So I lead with Hydrapple, it's Treads, it goes for Stealth Rock, and I get a one-hit KO turn 1. Nice. Okay, now for the last example of this video. I'm up against a Hyper Offense team. Once again, reminder to pause and try it for yourself. Okay, step 1, opponent's likely leads. I'd say we can eliminate Dragonite and Iron Moth. These are sweepers, and they'll want to pick their entry opportunities carefully, probably later in the game. Scizor might be choice banned, but given how hyper-offensive this team is, it's probably Swords Dance, so I'll say it's not likely, but I won't eliminate it completely. Hatterene is possible. It doesn't like facing my Galarian Slowking, but it could just accept paralyzing it with Nuzzle, maybe try to help out Iron Moth for a sweep later. Breloom is a sweeper, so you'd think we'd eliminate it, but it's so strong without setting up that it is sometimes effective as a lead. There's a small chance my opponent will start off with that, especially if they have Bulldoze or Rock Tomb to hit my Galarian Slowking or Tornadus super effectively. And by far, the most likely lead for my opponent here looks like Garchomp. As I said earlier, although every archetype likes setting up Stealth Rock, Hyper Offense in particular really wants to get it up fast. Garchomp also generally has the strongest matchup into my team. Nothing on my team really wants to deal with Garchomp, and I have no Dragon Resist. Alright, so we've got 4 possible leads, but I'm about 75% sure they're going to lead with Garchomp. So, step 2, what are my options? Well, Hydrapple just dies to Garchomp, Draco Meteor or Scale Shot, so that's out. Low Kicks also dies. Tornadus just can't do any meaningful damage to Garchomp and is setup fodder basically, so that's out. Galarian Slowking can live in Earthquake and Toxic, but if it's a Swords Dance Garchomp, I'll have to sack at least one Pokemon, so I'm not a fan of that option. Great Tusk is solid, it can do a lot with Ice Spinner even though it's not a one-hit KO, and Cinderace looks pretty good, it can Will-O-Wisp the Garchomp. So these are the 2 okay solutions, but let's move on to step 3 and look a bit more in depth. What's the bad scenario with Great Tusk? Well, if I lead Great Tusk into Breloom, that could be bad. Tusk into Hatterene is less scary but not ideal. And Tusk dying to a Life Orb Draco Meteor would also be unfortunate, some Garchomp leads do that. It would also be nice to keep Great Tusk healthy for Dragonite if possible. What about if we look at Cinderace? Probably the best counter lead to Cinderace is Hatterene or Iron Moth, and in both cases I go hard into Galarian Slowking. The other risk is that I miss Will-O-Wisp on Garchomp. Overall though, I'd say Cinderace covers my bases best here, so I'd lead with it. And fortunately I do not miss the Will-O-Wisp, and I get to neutralize the biggest threat to my team on turn 1. Excellent. If you enjoyed this video and or learned something, please consider subscribing and leaving a like, it helps out a lot. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments and I'll do my best to respond to them all. Also, those who have been watching my channel for a long time may recognize that this video is very similar to one I made 2 years ago. I'm considering updating several old videos with better production quality, more recent examples, fewer acronyms and abbreviations, and overall more polished scripts. Do you like this idea? Let me know. Well, that's all for today's lecture. Class dismissed.